I study local elections because I think they're an essential pathway to achieving greater equality, uh, um, especially for underrepresented communities in our country, in the local region and Bay Area, even around the world, of course. We need to do more to equalize voting along race and ethnic lines, along age lines, along education lines, right? And I think what we see here is that one of the main reasons for this is that voters, especially younger voters, and especially voters from underrepresented communities, lack information, and especially about some of the complex local rules, the institutions, the candidates, the stakes of an election. And so that is my sort of context for this today. I'm going to talk about one of those local rules, which is ranked choice voting. I think of it as an alternative to what we call plurality election systems. And that means that either one round or two round systems where you don't need a majority of votes necessarily to be elected, right? It used to be called, and it's sometimes called instant runoff voting. When it was adopted in San Francisco, it was called instant runoff voting. The idea was you eliminate the requirements for a runoff election between the top two candidates, and you calculate that using this ranked choice voting process. So either you eliminate a primary election or a runoff election, something like that, and then you have one election, and then you tally the candidates. And the way you do that is by allowing voters to rank order multiple candidate preferences. Changes a ballot to allow voters to rank multiple choices. They only have one vote, of course, but they rank that vote so in from 1 to 10 or as many as there are candidates. San Francisco used to only allow 3 rankings, right? And then they eliminate then any other primary or runoff elections that used to be used to achieve a majority. So that is the basic idea. It was then what we do is, of course, we allocate those votes in the tabulation process according to those rankings. And first, you count all the first place votes. If there's no majority winner, as we see here, after all the first place votes are counted, there's no majority winner. At that point, you eliminate the last place candidate. This process is repeated until there's one candidate with a majority. Some are used around the world, Australia and Ireland. Some of those have pictures of the candidates on them, which I think is really, really fascinating. And still, though, I think this is complicated. Asking people to rank 10 preferences is hard, right? But as we see here, you then should rank one candidate in each column and only one candidate in each column. You can rank as many as 10 in San Francisco. I believe it's similar in Berkeley, in Oakland, San Leandro. You can only rank one if you desire. So if you rank only one, you rank one. And here's the point. You can rank that one vote anywhere in the 10 slots. One of the rationales that ranked choice voting was sort of talked about to voters in the early 2000s was that runoff elections had lower voter turnout. Fair Vote, the main organization pushing ranked choice voting, would say this. They still say this. It's not true. Runoff elections often have higher voter turnouts, and in San Francisco, 3 of the 4 previous runoff elections had higher turnout than the sort of November general. But nonetheless, so we don't know the answer to that. I see this as a barrier, right? More complexity, that's going to be a barrier to participation. We've seen this throughout the 100 and some odd year history of local elections in the United States, that when we make voting a little bit harder, we should expect some negative consequences. That was my first sort of academic take on this. I'm one of the few scholars who study ranked choice voting who has this point of view. I compare voter turnout in the 7 cities that have used it for mayoral elections to 200 cities that are similar, that are non-ranked choice voting cities. It's sort of a quasi-experiment that I've set up. And this is elections before the adoption of ranked choice voting. These are elections after the adoption of ranked choice voting. And what I found is that turnout declined in the first 2 elections after ranked choice voting, and then it looks like that effect went away. And so I think that supports my hypothesis that the complexity seems to have maybe deterred some voters. And I found that there was lower voter turnout, specifically amongst Black voters and some white voters. That was older research of mine. And what I also found was that it exacerbated some of the turnout disparities, meaning that it advantaged higher education voters and also older voters that were used to the process, I think, a little bit. They were habitual voters. These were all, I think, support for my hypothesis, that the complexity, we should see it as a barrier, not an insurmountable barrier, but a barrier nonetheless, right? And then I also have some research showing that there was a higher probability of making a ballot error. I talked about those ballot errors, after the adoption of ranked choice voting in San Francisco. Now, these were small numbers, 1%, but that was quite a bit at the time. That's gone down perhaps since then. I think the Department of Elections has done a really good job on its voter education process, and I think these new ballots might help this as well. But this is why I'm doing this today, is that we need to inform voters about this and try to sort of you can use idea of helping voters understand this, and not just rely on the Department of Elections, right? As much as they do a good job, right? Really hard to get people engaged, but what I would say is that the more information they have, the better, and the more we sort of give them help them believe the idea that their vote matters, the better. Like when people feel like, I often hear those same sort of what I call cynical, like my vote doesn't matter, they don't care about me. That perception, especially at the local level, is not true, right? Candidates, and elected officials, they care. They know that re-election is so important, and that if they take positions that are against their constituents, it makes it harder for them to get reelected, right? And at the local level, especially sort of newly mobilizing, maybe racial ethnic minorities, sort of who may not be fully, incorporated into the political process, that when you feel like I think when you let them know that there are candidates on the ballot that maybe come from their communities, that maybe look like them, or maybe gender or sexual orientation, representation, those sorts of things really matter, right? And so what I try to do is get people to know that their vote matters, even if it's not just the presidential election, especially at the local level, and especially if they want to vote for candidates who are maybe different than the ones who are already winning, that really matters going forward. And it's that attitude of feeling connected to the process that is what gets people to be more likely to vote, and information about the process. So how to get registered and how to vote. So like what I worry about with ranked choice voting is, I don't want people to be like, it's so complex and here's what you're going to do, and then that's going to turn people off, right? The more information they feel like they need to know, it can turn them off a little bit. So there's a dance I try to play there where, yes, this is more complex, but we can give them information to help them. They can do it. That's the basic idea. We don't know is how will ranked choice voting affect the representation of minority communities. It is an open question. It's the thing I care about the most. I think there's arguments that it might hurt some minority community elected officials.